ready for a story that defies destiny. In a desert of sand and despair, a widow and her children struggled to survive. But what happens when a wounded stranger appears in their lives, unaware that he carries not only injuries, but also the key to change their realities forever? A saga of sacrifice, mystery, and the unexpected strength of the human heart. The scorching Texas sun mercilessly kissed the cracked earth of Finch Farm, and every grain of sand seemed to echo the emptiness in Sarah's stomach. A widow for 2 years, since a relentless fever took her beloved John, she found herself alone with 3 small children on an isolated property, more abandoned than the dry land that surrounded them. Fine dust seeped through the cracks of the old wooden cabin, covering everything with a gray mantle of desolation. Sarah, in her late 30s, had hands calloused from daily toil and a face marked by lines of worry. But her eyes, once vibrant, still held a spark of determination, a reflection of the unconditional love she felt for her children. Emily, the eldest, at 10 years old with hazel eyes that carried a premature maturity, tried to help as best she could. Her small, already skillful hands mended worn clothes, washed a few items in murky water, and dreamed of a future that seemed increasingly distant, imagining green fields and the abundance she had only seen in old books. Thomas, at 8, was the quieter one, a born observer. His keen eyes absorbed every detail of the environment, and his small hands already knew the weight of tools, dreaming of being a farmer like his father, overcoming the challenges of the land. And little Lily, just 5 years old, was the spark of joy that, at times, got lost in the gloom of scarcity. Her blonde curls and innocent smile were a constant reminder to Sarah of what truly mattered. Finch Farm, which had once been John's pride, was now a crumbling heap of wood and hope. The barn creaked in the wind, the fences were broken, and the few animals, 3 scrawny chickens and an old, stubborn cow that barely gave milk, were their only source of food. The well was almost dry, a deep hole that seemed to mock their constant thirst. The small corn crop, which they had sown with so much effort and so many prayers, withered under the harsh sun, its yellow leaves turning to dust. With each sunrise, Sarah faced the same agonizing question: how would she feed her children? The little food that remained was rationed painfully, and with each passing day, the marks of hunger and malnutrition became more visible on the children's pale faces, on their thin bodies. The nearest settlement, a dusty village called Harmony Creek, was a day's horse ride away. The few times Sarah managed to get there, sales of eggs and what little milk they had barely covered the cost of flour and a bit of salt. Distrust was palpable in the glances of the few merchants, who saw the widow and her children as just another family destined for failure in the arid Texas desert. The meager savings John had left were rapidly dwindling, a handful of coins that diminished daily. Sarah felt the weight of the world on her thin shoulders, the burden of being the sole provider and protector of her small family. Loneliness was a constant companion, as present as the smell of dust and sweat. Sarah had no friends nearby, and her relatives lived far away in other states, unable to help. Her only support was her children, whose resilience and unconditional love inspired her to continue, not to give up. The nights were the hardest, filled with the distant howl of coyotes, the creaking of the cabin, and Lily's muffled cries as she dreamed of fresh bread and a full glass of milk. Sarah spent hours gazing at the starry sky, searching for answers that never came, feeling trapped by a cruel fate, by a cycle of misery that seemed inescapable. The central conflict was clear: the desperate struggle for survival in a desolate environment, where every day was a battle against hunger, thirst, and hopelessness. Widow Sarah and her children were on the edge of an abyss, and it seemed that nothing, no one, could save them. Life had taken everything from them, and all that remained was their dignity, the strength of an unconditional love, and the faint flame of hope, the only wealth they possessed in their personal desert. The days passed, dragging with the slowness of an old wagon in quicksand. Each dawn brought the same exhausting routine. Sarah trying to coax a few eggs from the scrawny chickens, Emily tending to small household chores, and Thomas trying to fix something on the farm with the few available resources. With each dusk, the family lit a small fire more to ward off the darkness of the soul than the chill of the night, and huddled together, sharing the scarce warmth of their bodies and the few words of comfort they could utter. Hope was a luxury they could barely afford, a fragile feeling that threatened to break at any moment. The small garden, once a promise of sustenance, was now merely a graveyard of withered plants dried by the relentless sun, and the well day by day groaned with a lower water level threatening to dry up, completely taking with it the last drop of life. It was a stifling summer afternoon, the air heavy and dusty, when a strange sound broke the suffocating silence of the desert. It wasn't the howl of a coyote, nor the sound of the wind. It was a faint groan, almost inaudible, carried by the hot breeze. Sarah, who was mending one of John's worn shirts, abruptly raised her head, her heart tightening with a premonition. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice laden with apprehension. Thomas, with his keen hearing and protective instinct, pointed east, where the few skeletal trees rose against the reddish horizon. "It seemed to come from there, Mother," a sound of pain. Curiosity, mixed with a touch of fear and the innate instinct to help that always guided her, propelled Sarah. She grabbed an old rifle that John had kept for emergencies, more of a rusty symbol of security than a functional weapon, and, calling her children close, began to walk cautiously toward the sound, her steps raising small dust clouds. The sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the shadows lengthened, transforming the rocks into menacing, ghostly figures. As they approached a cluster of dry bushes and irregular stones, the groan became clearer, more desperate, a human lament, and then they saw him. Lying amidst the dust and gravel, a man. He was filthy, his leather clothes torn and covered in dried blood and dirt. His cowboy hat was crushed beside his head, and his face, though dirty, showed traces of nobility. His horse, a beautiful sorrel, was tied to a nearby bush, visibly exhausted but unharmed, nibbling on some dry shrubs. The man, a sturdy cowboy by his build, was unconscious, with a nasty, deep wound on his leg, from which blood still slowly seeped, and a deep cut on his forehead. He seemed to have fallen from his horse at high speed or been attacked by some wild animal, perhaps a mountain lion. Emily, her eyes wide with horror, covered her mouth with her hands, a gasp of astonishment escaping her lips. Lily, with childlike sensitivity, began to cry softly, clutching her mother's skirt. Thomas, though frightened, looked at the man with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, his small fists clenched. Sarah, despite the initial shock and instinct for self-preservation, did not hesitate. Her compassionate nature, which hard life had never managed to extinguish, took over. "He's hurt," she said, her voice firm, though her heart pounded erratically in her chest. "We need to help him." The dilemma was clear. Bring a stranger into their home, a risk in such uncertain times where distrust was the rule, or leave him there to die in the middle of the desert. But for Sarah, the answer was non-negotiable. Humanity, for her, came before any fear, before any risk calculation. With the help of Thomas, who was surprisingly strong for his age, and Emily, who fetched water from the cowboy's own leather canteen to try and clean the wounds, they managed with great effort to drag the man back to the farm. The journey back was arduous, each step a struggle against the weight of the inert body and the exhaustion that had long accompanied them. But they succeeded. Upon reaching the cabin, the priority was to stop the bleeding. Sarah, with steady hands and rudimentary first aid knowledge, learned from John, used a few clean pieces of cloth. She had to clean the wounds and bandage his leg and forehead while the children watched in silence, their faces reflecting the tension of the moment. Night fell. bringing not only the desert chill, but the certainty that their lives, in some profound and irreversible way, had just changed. The stranger, lying on their simple bed, carried a mystery, a burden of worry, but also, perhaps, a small spark of hope amidst the darkness that enveloped him. They didn't know who he was or where he came from, but one thing was certain. His arrival opened a new and unpredictable chapter in their already challenging lives. The hours dragged slowly through that night, filled with a palpable tension within the small cabin. The cowboy, William Vance, still unconscious, breathed with difficulty, a hoarse sound that filled the air. Sarah, exhausted, sat beside him, applying cold compresses to his feverish forehead, changing them every few minutes. Emily and Thomas, though overcome with fatigue, took turns keeping the fire alive, feeding the embers with small twigs and watching the stranger, their eyes attentive to any movement. Lily, finally overcome by sleep, slept nestled in her mother's lap, a small, fragile body dependent on everything. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the man's heavy breathing, the crackling of the embers in the stove, and the wind softly howling outside. Sarah studied the stranger's face in the dim light, a man with marked features, perhaps from a hard life on the range, but with an aura of distinction, an air of someone accustomed to authority, even wounded and vulnerable. His clothes, though dirty and torn, revealed superior quality, fine cotton fabric and soft leather that Sarah hadn't seen in years, not since the days John visited the big town. At dawn, with the first rays of sun peeking through the window cracks, painting the dirt floor with golden light, the cowboy finally opened his eyes. His deep blue eyes blinked a few times, struggling to focus, to adapt to the brightness. Where am I?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. Sarah, with a palpable relief that spread throughout her body, leaned over him. "You are safe. We found you wounded on the road near our farm. I am Sarah, and these are my children, Emily, Thomas, and Lily." The man tried to sit up, a sudden movement that was intercepted by an excruciating pain in his injured leg, making him groan and fall back onto the makeshift cot. "Don't exert yourself," Sarah advised him, her voice soft but firm. "You are badly injured. You need complete rest." In the days that followed, as the cowboy slowly recovered, a routine was established in the small cabin. Sarah and the children cared for him with surprising dedication, sharing what little food they had, thin broth, a piece of hard bread, and ensuring that his wounds were clean and bandaged. The man, who introduced himself as William Vance, was an enigma. He spoke little about himself, responding to questions with monosyllables or diverting the topic, but his polite manners, the tone of his voice, and the gold ring on his finger adorned with a complex crest that Sarah couldn't decipher suggested that he was not an ordinary cowboy, a farm laborer like the few she knew. He observed the family with a thoughtful gaze, noting the poverty that surrounded them, the scarcity of everything, but also the dignity, the unity, and the unwavering strength of spirit that kept them going. One day, as Emily brought him some fresh water from their newly opened well, William, now able to sit up, questioned her. "You seem like a bright girl, Emily. What do you do around here? Do you just live off this farm?" Emily, with the frankness of childhood, without hesitation, told him about the relentless drought, the tragic loss of her father, the farm on the verge of ruin, the drying well, the hunger. She spoke of her mother's daily struggle, the constant battle for survival, the hope that drained away each day like sand through their fingers. William listened attentively, his blue eyes fixed on her, absorbing every word. Sarah, who was nearby mending a piece of clothing, completed the story, describing their disillusionment with the system, the lack of help from local authorities, the feeling of being trapped in a vicious cycle of misery with no apparent way out. She didn't hide the harsh reality, the nights without food, and the uncertainty of tomorrow, the pain of seeing her children suffer. William, who had managed to get up and was walking with the aid of a makeshift crutch, listened to everything with a serious, thoughtful expression. In the end, he looked at Sarah, their eyes meeting in a moment of silence charged with emotion, a mutual understanding that transcended words. "You saved me," he said, his voice stronger and filled with more gratitude than usual. "You gave me a new chance, and you gave me something I had lost long ago. Faith in human kindness, the belief that compassion still exists in this world." He paused dramatically, and then a sudden and shocking revelation occurred, changing the course of the narrative forever. "I am not just a cowboy, Sarah. I am William Vance, the owner of the Vance Ranch, one of the largest and most prosperous properties in all of Texas, with vast lands, cattle, and investments throughout the state. I was on a remote inspection trip and had an accident. My family must be desperately looking for me, sending search parties across the entire territory. But I see that you are in a desperate situation too, a poverty you do not deserve." He took a solid gold locket from his neck, opening it to reveal the image of an elegant woman and 2 children, his own. "This is my wife and my children. I promise you, Sarah, that I will not forget you. When I am recovered and back at my ranch, I will do whatever it takes to repay the invaluable kindness you have shown me. You gave me a new lease on life, and I will give you a new lease on your lives, a life of dignity and prosperity." William's revelation left Sarah and the children in shock. This man, whom they had found on the verge of death, was incredibly wealthy, a cattle magnate, a name known throughout the state. His promise, uttered with such sincerity and conviction, seemed like a miracle, a divine intervention in their lives. The despair that had been rooted in their hearts for so long began to give way to a seed of hope, small but powerful, sprouting in the arid soil of their existence. Life, which seemed condemned to misery and darkness, might perhaps have a new and bright direction. The turning point was not just William's identity, but the promise of a future they had never dared to dream of, a chance to escape a fate that seemed sealed. The cabin, once a stage of misery and suffering, was now permeated with a new and unexpected possibility, a glimpse of a dawn they never imagined they would see. The revelation of William Vance's true identity echoed in the small cabin, mixing with the smell of dust and the newly born hope. Sarah felt a cautious blend of skepticism and a trembling flame of optimism. Would this man, with all his power and wealth, truly remember the promise made from a bed of pain and vulnerability? Doubt was a persistent shadow in her heart, for life had already taught her not to trust promises lightly. Emily and Thomas, with the innocence of youth, already envisioned a future without hunger, with green fields and abundant water, their childish minds already building castles in the air. Lily, oblivious to the gravity of the situation and more concerned with playing, simply smiled at Uncle William, who was now not just a stranger, but a friend. William, though still weak and with his leg bandaged, felt the urgency to return to his family at Vance Ranch. He knew that his prolonged absence caused apprehension, and that Vance Ranch, a vast and complex enterprise with hundreds of employees, needed his command and strategic decisions. However, his gratitude for the family who had rescued him was immense, a deep feeling he would carry forever. He observed Sarah's simplicity and resilience, the sparkle of intelligence in Emily's eyes, Thomas's innate curiosity, and Lily's pure joy. That family, despite their material poverty and hard life, possessed a richness of spirit, a unity and goodness that he rarely saw in his own world of opulence and power, a world often cold and calculating. Before leaving, William made a solemn promise to Sarah, looking her in the eyes with unquestionable sincerity. "I will send someone here soon, Sarah," he said, his voice laden with conviction and seriousness. "Please, trust me. You saved my life, and I never forget a debt of gratitude." He instructed Sarah on how to send a message to the Vance Ranch foreman should they need anything urgent. and gave her a small bag of solid gold coins, a gesture of immediate help for the family's most pressing needs. "This is just an advance," he added, a gentle smile on his face, noticing her reluctance to accept. "What I have in mind for you is much greater, something that will change your lives forever." Days turned into weeks. William's departure left an emptiness in the cabin, but also a tense expectation and a thread of hope. Sarah used the gold wisely, buying essential supplies, flour, beans, some medicine for Lily, who had caught a cold. However, as time passed and no news arrived, doubt began to gnaw at the hope that had sprouted. Had it all been a dream? A delirium of a wounded man? The farm remained dry and desolate. The difficulties had not disappeared, and the wind still whispered the name of scarcity in her ears. The tension increased with each passing day without news from Vance Ranch. Emily, who had clung to the idea of a better life, began to look downcast, her eyes losing their sparkle. Thomas, with his more skeptical and practical nature, grumbled that rich people didn't care about the poor and that promises were just empty words. Sarah struggled to keep faith, not to let despair settle in her heart again. She remembered William's sincere gaze, his words of gratitude that the world was cruel, and promises were often just illusions. The climax of tension came on a stifling afternoon, when the sun was high and the children were complaining of hunger, their stomachs rumbling. The well was almost dry, and the last chicken had died, leaving them without any immediate food source. Sarah felt the weight of failure on her shoulders, tears welling in her eyes, a sharp pain that seemed to tighten her chest. She was on the verge of giving in to despair, of accepting that luck would never smile upon them, that they were condemned to a life of misery. It was at that exact moment, when darkness seemed to completely engulf them, that a distant but unmistakable sound broke the oppressive silence of the desert. The trotting of horses, growing louder and louder. At first, Sarah thought it was just a mirage, a trick of the heat and exhaustion. But the sound became more distinct, and soon, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon, announcing the arrival of something big. Emily ran out of the cabin, her eyes wide, pointing and shouting, "Mother, look on the horizon." It was a large, sturdy wagon, pulled by 2 strong horses, and accompanied by several men on horseback, all wearing the unmistakable crest of Vance Ranch on their immaculate uniforms. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest, an explosion of relief and joy. The promise was not a delusion. William Vance had kept his word. One of the men, a kind-faced, gray-bearded foreman named Jebediah, dismounted and approached with a smile. "Mrs. Sarah?" he asked, respectfully tipping his hat. "Mr. Vance sent me. He's recovering, but he insisted that we come to help. He said this farm is now, shall we say, a special project of Vance Ranch." The tension that had squeezed Sarah's chest for weeks dissolved in a deep sigh of relief, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. The children, seeing the happiness on their mother's face and the arrival of supplies, began to jump with excitement, fear replaced by euphoria. William's promise was real. Hope had not died in the desert, but had found a new and powerful ally, a beacon of light in their darkness. The arrival of the Vance Ranch team marked the beginning of a transformation that seemed miraculous. The imposing, full wagon was overflowing with provisions that would bring tears to Sarah's eyes. Bags of white flour, various grains, dried meat, canned fruit, and to the children's surprise and delight, even some simple toys for Lily, who shone with a genuine and long-forgotten joy for the first time. The men, under the careful and practical supervision of Jebediah, the foreman, began working immediately. They were not just supply deliverers. They were engineers, builders, agronomists, and, above all, messengers of a new era for Sarah's family. The first and most crucial task was the well. With modern equipment Sarah had never seen, a powerful drill, sturdy ropes, and an efficient pulley system, and the technical knowledge of William's men, The well was deepened to impressive levels. To everyone's joy and astonishment, a vein of crystalline, abundant water was found dozens of meters down, gushing with a force that promised not to dry up. Water, such a scarce and precious commodity in the desert, now flowed with a promise of life and prosperity. Next, the fields, once dry and barren, were revitalized. New irrigation systems of canals and small dikes were installed, and high-quality, drought-resistant seeds were planted. Finch Farm, which was once a symbol of misery and desolation, began to flourish again, a verdant oasis in the arid desert, its crops promising a bountiful harvest. But William's help was not limited to the farm alone. He had given specific instructions for Sarah's family to receive all necessary support. A sturdy, well-built small barn was erected for the few chickens and the cow, and a productive garden, full of various vegetables, was created under the guidance of one of Vance's ranch's experienced agronomists who taught Sarah about crop rotation and soil management. Sarah, who had spent so long fighting alone against nature and scarcity, felt the relief of having support and expertise. She worked side by side with William's men, learning new techniques and feeling, for the first time in a long time, part of something bigger, part of a team. The biggest surprise, however, came with the arrival of a small, polished, and comfortable carriage a few days later, bringing not only more supplies, but also a private tutor. William, knowing the children's passion for learning and Sarah's desire for education for her children, had arranged for a tutor. Classes were held in a small area of the cabin, which had been transformed into an impromptu classroom, and the teacher, a kind and patient man named Mr. Davies, brought with him books, maps, globes, and stories that opened up a new and vast world for the children. Emily delighted in the books, absorbing every word like a sponge, dreaming of the distant land she read about. Thomas, with his analytical mind and practical interest, was interested in science and mathematics applied to agriculture. And even little Lily, previously so quiet, laughed and participated in classes with enthusiasm, drawing colorful figures and learning her first letters with ease. The turning point of the story, the true emotional climax, occurred a few weeks later, when William Vance, still recovering from his leg injury, but visibly stronger and healthier, paid a personal visit to the farm. He arrived in a luxurious carriage, accompanied by his wife, Eleanor, and their 2 children, a boy and a girl, elegantly dressed, but with sincere smiles. The reunion was moving. Sarah, with tears of gratitude in her eyes, warmly embraced William, expressing her thanks with all her heart, unable to hold back the words. "Mr. Vance, you saved our lives. I can never thank you enough for everything you've done." William, in turn, embraced her with equal intensity, expressing his gratitude for saving him. "You gave me a second chance at life, Sarah. And this is my way of repaying that, of honoring that debt. I see that the farm is prospering like never before, and the children are growing up in an environment of hope and knowledge. That's what truly matters to me." He sat with Sarah, Emily, Thomas, and Lily, sharing a simple yet abundant meal, prepared with fresh produce from the farm itself. The conversation flowed freely, and William announced an even more ambitious plan, a true turning point. He would offer Sarah a management position at one of Vance Ranch's largest farms, where she could use her innate organizational skills and resilience to help oversee other properties of the vast enterprise. Furthermore, he would ensure that Emily and Thomas had access to the best education available, financing their studies at prestigious schools, and that Lily had every opportunity to flourish in any area she chose. Sarah's and her children's lives had drastically changed. Despair had been replaced by hope, scarcity by abundance, and loneliness by a deep connection with a generous and grateful family who welcomed them as their own. The climax of the narrative was not just material prosperity, but tangible proof that kindness, even in the midst of the greatest adversity, can sow a future of infinite possibilities, a true rebirth.